Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday, the 25th of January. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. First, we will have today's coronavirus update. Then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. As of 2 p.m. today, there are 8,022 cases, including cases identified using either a first lateral flow device or a PCR positive test. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,392 were in hospital last night, 34 of whom were in intensive care. There are 23 new reported deaths of Scotland who have tested positive, and that means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 10,222. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures show that 154,356 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 439 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. And as of 7:30 a.m. this morning, 4,406,999 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 4,112,264 had received their second dose, and 3,263,981 had received their third dose or booster. Now, I'm delighted that we are joined this evening by a regular guest and contributor to Scotland at 7. He's the retired business executive and is also now a writer and blogger and commentator. And of course, he's also Edinburgh's answer to Stan Getz. Welcome, Peter Curran. How are you keeping?
I'm fine. I wish you'd got a more appropriate sex comparison.
Well, it's great. It's great to see you this evening, Peter, and thank you for joining us in Scotland at 7.
Delighted.
The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service today published its long-awaited report into the second fire at the Glasgow School of Art. The report finds that it is likely that the fire started on the east side on or above level 4 of the Macintosh building. It adds that an unlimited air supply fed through the duct system, which served to intensify the fire, promoting uncontrolled fire growth and rapid development. 50% of the entire building was well alight within 38 minutes of the arrival of firefighters. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service fire investigation team was mobilised as part of the extensive response, and the investigation began immediately. The report recommends that lessons learned from the Macintosh building fire in 2018 should be carefully considered by key stakeholders involved in future construction and renovation projects. The Deputy Chief Fire Officer Ross Haggart said, "We were unable to find sufficient evidence to support any credible origin, and it has not been possible to establish a definitive cause. However, we have made a number of recommendations, including the introduction of new mechanisms to enhance information sharing around ongoing construction projects within Scotland to ensure the safety of our firefighters and our communities." So, Peter, first of all, the independent fire safety consultant Stephen Mackenzie said that the report today has thrown up more questions than it answers, and he's called for a separate public inquiry into the blaze. He said, "I suggest, given the total destruction of a national treasure, all lines of public inquiry should be pursued and lessons learned before the next historic treasure is lost." Now, the report today has been characterised by some as I say, asking more questions than it answers. And given perhaps Glasgow's former reputation as Tinder City, the cultural significance of this building, and the question around governance of institutions and organisations who are trustees of such important national assets, do you think that a public inquiry is the next step? Is it justified?
Absolutely. I mean, like most Glaswegians, even ones like me who never attended the art school or higher education for that matter, the art school, as we always called it, was a fixture. It was a place any friends in Glasgow, any friends from overseas, I said, you have to see this classic building. And I felt a sense of personal loss at the first fire, but that we should have a second fire so soon after beggared belief. And I remember the newsreel pictures of the horror stricken bystanders in the street. Some were actually crying, and I understand that. If I'd been there, I would have been crying too. The art school, I've been in the art school more than once. I was in it with my boss in Scottish Newcastle, not all that long after I'd worked in the Goodyear factory, which was a highly inflammable set of processes in Drumchapel. And I immediately smelt the solvents. That the place was saturated with inflammable solvents used in paints. And when you looked at the woodwork and the complex access, wonderful architecture though it was, and the knowledge that a number of art students were not noted at the best of times for their impeccable social behaviour on occasion, that the place seemed to me like a bomb going off. And I made discreet inquiries about what their fire safety procedures were, and was greeted at that time, this is quite a few years ago, with blank stares of, well, the usual stuff. So there's two dimensions to this as far as I'm concerned. It's certainly what caused the fire, but the critical reason of asking the question and identifying what caused the fire is to say, why was this allowed to happen? And if it had to happen, why was it not immediately mitigated by state-of-the-art fire prevention and fire extinguishing procedures? That we all know the history of the sprinklers. It seemed to me that the report today made a lot of the mysterious stranger, unknown man who was seen heading away from the building. There seems to be no evidence that he had anything to do with it. It seemed to be almost looking for spectres outside the remit of anybody's inquiry to explain this away. If I was going back to what I referred to in an earlier conversation as Occam's razor, I said the most likely reasons for any fire to start are either deliberate arson or negligence or an inherently unsafe workplace, which its unsafety had not been recognised and prepared for. So, yes, I would have liked to have seen the cause of the fire identified. I think there still should be an inquiry in how in God's name did it happen and why was it able to happen the second time, even if it was down to construction accidents or sparks at night, that there should have been infinitely better procedures in place. Given one fire, you sure as hell can't afford another over a monument of national and international significance. So yes, I should think there should be a major inquiry.
That's a fair point that you make, Peter. To have one significant fire appears very unfortunate. To have two significant fires back to back starts to begin to look like carelessness, or a want of care at least. We know that over the last few years we've seen a number of very significant buildings being very seriously damaged. I'm thinking of Notre Dame Cathedral and also Windsor Castle. And in both those cases, and in the case of the MAC, the damage, the fires took place while the buildings were being refurbished. And I think in terms of the report that was published by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service today, they identified that the ducting, which was fundamentally involved in the first fire, had remained in the building and was left open during the refurbishment and the reconstruction works. And that there's a view that
Absolutely.
caused or that at least accelerated the significant spread of the fire, as the report says. 50% of the building was well alight within 40 minutes of the fire having been identified. So, do you think, in terms of our treatment, our approach to restoring significant national assets like the MAC, that we should be taking a different approach to what might be described as standard construction techniques, and we should be taking a great deal more care?
Yes, I don't want to damn the whole construction industry with isolated instances, but I did work for a period of about a year in construction. And put it this way, many construction firms and many construction practices do not err on the side of safety. They're desperately trying to come in under budget to cut costs. And there's the other thing, which is the cause of multiple accidents in industry, whether fire or of other natures, and that is what I call habituation. That people who work in a dangerous process are initially highly aware of the drills and protocols that they have to carry out and the havoc that could be caused. But they gradually, being human animals, they acclimatize themselves to this and they become slack. I mean, that's what worries me about the nuclear industry. You know, at the end of the day, human error is the kind of thing that will blow up a nuclear plant or ultimately blow us into a nuclear war. The machinery may be infallible, the algorithms may be infallible, although that's highly unlikely, but the people sure as hell aren't. So the other thing I think, anybody who's experienced major fires, as we had an earlier conversation about, anybody who has seen the consequences, not only physical and economically, but to people of major fires, could never ever treat fire lightly. And I've seen all three.
Absolutely, Peter. It's a good point that you make. I think prior to these two fires, people would have identified that the principal asset to the Glasgow School of Art was the people, not the building. And that would be
Absolutely.
understandable. It's a place of learning. However, in circumstances where we find such national assets as the building of the Macintosh School of Art, do you think, in terms of the governance of the institutions who are trustees of these buildings and of the institutions, do you think we need to look a little bit more carefully at who is appointed to positions of responsibility in order that, for example, an awareness of the fallibility of humans in operating and preserving very valuable assets, that we take a different approach and we perhaps mitigate more strongly against the risks of humans?
Absolutely. And without in any way reflecting on the people who managed the, the School of Art, in general terms, there is a tendency for certain things, and artistic and national monuments are one of them, for appointments to go to people not on the basis of competence, but in the fact that they belong to that elusively defined group, the great and the good. There are some people who pop up all the time, whether it's on committees or as trustees or as non-exec directors, and they make a virtue of this. But for some that I've seen, I haven't seen the School of Art closely in that respect, in any respect, but for some people like that, they regard it as a jolly. They almost regard it as the equivalent of a Downing Street party in the garden. You don't see the powerful thing that they're managing and its uniqueness and the appalling nature of the loss of something unique and, in the truest sense, irreplaceable. Now, in fairness to Notre Dame, I think the French were always aware of that, and it's a hugely complex place. Even the legendary hunchback of Notre Dame had his trouble scampering about all the passageways without hanging himself on the bell ropes. But you know, and that was, I mean, the French people. I don't think they'll ever recover from the shock of what happened to Notre Dame. Let's hope the reconstruction will be done impeccably and gives them restores that wonderful national pride. I mean, in a sense, Notre Dame is La France in bricks and mortars and wood and stone.
That's a very good point, Peter. The manifestation of national consciousness and of nations in their built environment is a very good point. So I think there's certainly plenty of arguments that we should be thinking even more carefully and even more seriously about how we manage these buildings. But let's move on to our next story now, because businesses can prepare to resume hybrid working from Monday, the 31st of January, enabling more people to have a flexible return to working between home and the office. Due to the continued decline in COVID case rates and the progressing easing of protective measures, businesses can implement a return that offers staff more flexibility while ensuring steps are taken to mitigate the potential spread of COVID. Eligible businesses in the hospitality, leisure, culture, and tourism sectors that were impacted by the necessary public health measures introduced to stop the spread of Omicron are now receiving grant payments. The Scottish Government is working at pace with local authorities and other delivery partners to ensure that business support funding is paid to all eligible businesses as quickly as possible. The Economy Secretary, Kate Forbes, said, "I want to thank businesses and their staff for the continued understanding and willingness to work with the Scottish Government and local partners to respond to the changing challenges we have faced as a result of the pandemic, including responding quickly to the necessary public health measures introduced to stop the spread of Omicron in December." The Scottish Government has said it is firmly focused on doing all it can to support businesses and grow the Scottish economy. As well as the £375 million business support package, businesses in Scotland continue to benefit from domestic rates relief, with a forecast £802 million in 2022-23. So, Peter, first of all, thinking about the political response to the changing challenges of COVID over the last 2 years, and in particular, as the economy secretary pointed out, the changes that were required during December in response to the spread of the Omicron variant, I'm minded that opposition politicians in Scotland seem to be more and more wrong-footed by the way in which pandemics develop and the way in which public health agencies are required to respond. And we've seen certainly the Conservatives in Scotland calling for masks to be introduced in Scotland when they're being removed in England, and then calling them for them to be removed in Scotland when they're being introduced when they're being introduced in England. So that tells us a little bit about the way in which smaller governments and the governments that are closer to their population are able to move and to address challenges more swiftly in a way that some other politicians sometimes seem to struggle to keep up with.
Yes, I think that's undoubtedly a factor. I mean, there is a tendency, always has been in my experience, a marked tendency to think that big is good. And certainly when I was doing my rudimentary economic studies for the Institute of Personnel and Development, they were flogging on about economies of scale. Now, economies of scale undoubtedly do exist, and they're pretty obvious in many cases, but there are also massive diseconomies of scale. I mean, if you go back to military strategy, way back in the great theorists of strategy, they recognized the difference between the ability to have a giant gun which could fire huge projectiles 2 or 3 miles away, which seemed dramatic at that time, and manned by vast, highly complex crews. They also realized that a good, tight commando team with a couple of long knives could snip in and disable the entire show because of their flexibility and speed of response. So I think that the smaller nations in the world have demonstrated that beyond doubt. That their reactivity is faster, their politics are faster, they've got better understanding, and crucially, because they're small and they need to interact with larger alliances and treaties with multiple smaller nations, they acquire a greater ability to deal with people and balance conflicting pressures. And despite all its critics, and some of the criticism was undoubtedly valid, the EU was a classic example of that. The EU politicians who've served in the EU for a long time, we have our own Scots experts in that respect, realise how alliances are formed, how decisions are reached quickly, how deadlocks are broken. And whereas if you're sitting back saying, we are the wonderful sovereign Britain, and the last shining jewel of the British Empire, and we have been doing things right for the last several centuries, you just do not have that psychologically embedded speed of response. And I think that was manifest in the pandemic. Andrew Dunlop, who's a former Conservative spin doctor and writes for the Herald, he's very definitely one of their unionist opinion journalists, nonetheless come up with a good analysis of the civil service. He had his little kicks at the SNP, but basically he was saying it's not only the politicians have failed here, the civil service in many respects have failed. And he pointed out that before the pandemic happened, the British civil service, the UK civil service, were preparing for a pandemic. The only problem was they were preparing for a flu pandemic, not a coronavirus pandemic. Coronavirus was a known threat and an unknown future threat. but people were locked in. Well, flu happens once a year, and we have this, and it's so many years since the 1918 flu, and pandemics recur. They get locked in a grand narrative because of their size. And once a big organization has a grand narrative, it's very difficult to break through it, short of being a whistleblower or actively trying to wreck the system. So I think what you said is absolutely true.
Thank you, Peter. Now, our next story is that Sue Gray's inquiry into alleged lockdown breaches number 10 could be delivered to the Prime Minister as soon as this evening, according to some reports, and is expected to be released this week, possibly even by tomorrow, after the Metropolitan Police said that they would not stand in the way of publication. Number 10 has said, subject to legal advice, that it would not block any publication, clearing the way for Boris Johnson to face damaging allegations about his conduct and the behaviour of his staff amid the new police investigation. Johnson does not believe he broke the law, his spokesperson said. The SNP have demanded that Sue Gray's report must be published without delay, amid reports that Downing Street may attempt to block publication. Commenting, the SNP's Westminster Deputy Leader Kirsten Oswald MP said, Sue Gray's report cannot be kicked into the long grass while the Metropolitan Police conduct their investigation. There is nothing stopping Ms Gray's report from being published as planned, given that the Metropolitan Police has not raised any objections. So, Peter, first of all, the position of the Cabinet Office or the Civil Service inquiry into the alleged events at Downing Street seems to have moved around a little bit in the way in which it's been positioned over the last little while. So, when it was initially announced, when it was Simon Case who would lead the investigation, it was the Prime Minister said that the entire report would be placed in the House of Commons library. Since then, we've been told that Sue Gray's report, the findings, might be publicised. And now there's the added complication of whether or not it should be published or not before the Metropolitan Police get around to investigating and reporting allegations. So do you think this is an indication that Downing Street doesn't know what to do and is changing direction? Or is it that they are trying to muddy the water and confuse people by attempting to do different things with different reports, all of which are focused on the same events?
I think Downing Street, in the sense of Boris and his, have to say, his alleged cabinet, I would call them a cabal, know what to do. The problem is what they want to do is what quite clearly should not be done. But there is the technical problem. The British Civil Service is set up to serve to the highest degree of professionalism the government of the day. And Sue Gray was commissioned to do this report by the Prime Minister and is reporting to the Prime Minister. She owes no other duty than that. And I'm sure she's an eminently ethical and devoted and capable civil servant. So they placed her in a dilemma. And short of dramatic gestures, which are not typical of the civil service, although we've had a few under Boris, of resigning and say, I can't hold any kind of morality of discharging my responsibilities under such a Prime Minister. There is a problem. Whether full publication can be compelled. I mean, it seems initially that we're relying on independent crowd-funded bodies like the Good Law Society or even individuals to bring legal action to compel this government to behave ethically and in accordance with the 7 Nolan principles. I mean, I had to watch Cressida Dick today and say, there is a very uncomfortable lady who has been resisting for reasons that she clearly thought were valid, that she couldn't possibly do an investigation into this. The reality is they don't want this to become something on the level of the Profumo scandal or Mondi Gregory and the sale of peerages by Lloyd George. So if it wasn't because it's a bloody shambles, I'd look forward eagerly to what's coming.
A shambles is right, and you're also right, Peter. The appearance by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in front of the London Assembly this morning was quite instructive. She had clearly consulted lawyers at considerable length and in detail before making her appearance. So it certainly gave the impression that this story has plenty of legs and will continue through this week and into subsequent weeks. So I'm sure that you and I and we on Broadcasting Scotland will be talking about it at length in the future. But we'll move on
Indeed.
to our next story now, and that is back in Scotland. The SNP has demanded that Willie Rennie apologise to the people in Scotland for providing an unnecessary distraction after the chair of the UK Statistics Authority rubbished his claims on COVID statistics. Sir David Norgrove wrote to the North East Fife MSP and confirmed that the First Minister correctly stated Scotland's infection rate was more than 20% lower than in England. In his letter, the Stats Body Chair said, the data does suggest that the rate of infection is lower in Scotland than in England. And he goes on to say that it would also be correct to say that the prevalence of COVID-19 was around 1 percentage point higher in England than in Scotland. Commenting, the SNP MSP Siobhan Brown said, Willie Rennie's letter to the Office of National Statistics has backfired spectacularly. The impartial referee he chose to look into COVID statistics and the comparison with England has ruled, and far from the claims of the opposition, the impartial UK chief statistician has settled the question of whether Scotland has seen higher or lower levels of infection than England. She continued, he definitively states the data does suggest that the rate of infection is lower in Scotland than in England. So firstly, Peter, suggesting that the enhanced COVID restrictions in Scotland made no difference to the rates of infection seems to have been a wee bit of a trope for opposition politicians recently. I witnessed Stephen Kerr peddling the same nonsense over the weekend. So are we now in an era where perhaps all that opposition politicians seem able to do is to recycle each other's debunked quackery and short-sighted opportunism rather than coming up with policies for the people of Scotland?
Well, yes, although I don't think there's anything particularly new about that in Scottish politics or politics in general. What fascinated me about this is when politicians play with numbers, they either play with numbers from a standpoint of being highly capable with numbers, and some have a quite high level of mathematical education. The fact is, a large percentage of the population, including the educated professional population, are sometimes close to functionally illiterate. It depends what the thing is. Now, I am no mathematician. A 15-year-old school leaver, such mathematics as I acquired after school, and they're basically arithmetical. I don't have a high concept of algebra. I had to work Archimedes' isosceles triangle thing because of the nature of the rubber industry. So I could do limited algebra. But one thing I realized is the most misused statistic of any, the most misused number, it surrounds percentages. And I don't know, the number of professional people I've had arguments with trying to remind them that a percentage is a relationship between two other numbers, two other statistics. And unless you state that 3-point relationship, it's meaningless. Now, in this case, the two other figures, statistics, were used to come up with a rate, just as the R number is a rate. You've got to be careful, as you know, Andrew, as a lawyer, you will understand these things as well as anybody, that you can make awful mistakes trying to treat percentages as if they were numbers in their own right. But as soon as I saw this, I said, Nicola is right, because these were two rates derived from two other numbers. And as far as Willie Rennie being a distraction and I can't remember the exact phrase you used. I think Willie Rennie and the Liberal Party have always been a distraction, and they're an even bigger distraction under their present leader. I have difficulty even mentioning him in any serious context, and I focus on Tories and Labour. But I mean, these are all allegations subject to proof in the laws of defamation, which I'm anxious to avoid.
Absolutely, Peter. One other question, just to think about the politics a little bit more for a second. This story was headlined today with the idea that Willie Rennie was embarrassed. I wonder, is that realistic? He wasn't embarrassed when that beagle punched him in the mouth in front of the Holyrood, or he wasn't embarrassed when all manner of farm animals have sought to interrupt his press calls by copulating behind him, and he wasn't didn't seem to be embarrassed when the number of Lib Dems in Holyrood shrank in 2021 to such a small number that they don't even qualify as a political party under the Parliament's rules. So, is it possible for Willie Rennie to be embarrassed?
No, I don't think so. And I think many politicians will envy him this talent, which is the only visible one I've ever been able to detect of being unembarrassable. But it's undoubtedly very useful for a politician. Uh, I remember during, no, I'm not making any parallels with Lib Dems or anything in Britain, but during the McCarthy era, uh, one of McCarthy's people, and McCarthy himself, sort of said something appalling about a young guy and sort of destroyed his reputation, etc. And a lawyer uh, got up from the forum and said, "Sir, have you no shame?" And I wouldn't say Willie. I think Willie's probably a decent guy in every aspect of his life. So I don't think he lacks shame. He just lacks the recognition of when he should be ashamed, which is a very different thing. It's a capacity deficiency rather than planned. I'm sorry about that, Willie. I mean, I think you'd really be a nice guy if I met you. I never have. And now that I've said that, I'm not looking forward to meeting you.
Thanks, Peter. We'll move on to our next story now, which is that ahead of the report stage of the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, the SNP has warned that the bill is a stain on democracy and a blatant attempt by Boris Johnson and the Tory government to undermine the judiciary and the rule of law. The SNP is supporting amendments to remove Clause 1 of the bill, which seeks to reform the judicial review process. According to the Public Law Project, this will make it harder for people to hold governments to account. SNP MPs are also working to ensure that the legislation cannot contravene Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights on the right to a fair trial. Commenting, the SNP's Justice spokesperson Anne McLaughlin MP said, "This bill is a blatant attempt to interfere with the judiciary and remove the checks and balances which are vital in a healthy democracy, and it is, quite frankly, dangerous." So, Peter, first of all, we can see that the Prime Minister and his mates and staff consider themselves to be above the law, at least when it comes to COVID restrictions. So, should we be surprised that they want to put themselves above judicial review too? Do you think, is this a spiteful reaction to the decisions of the Supreme Court just before Brexit? Or is it driven by some sort of racism and an attempt to remove legal rights from asylum seekers and refugees? Or is it part of a wider plan to prevent anyone interfering in the kind of money making schemes like VIP lanes for Tory friends and family when they're selling PPE in a pandemic?
At its best, it displays a total ignorance of the concept of the rule of law and the relationship between the rule of law and law enforcement and between them and the government of a country. I mean, I'm not a lawyer and I've never studied law as such. In fact, such law as I have is mainly about American law, derived from endless watchings and re-watchings of the wonderful American series Law and Order, which
Yes.
explored just about every ethical and legal dilemma I can think of, but in the concept of the American system and the US Constitution. But my understanding of a judge is someone, going right back to biblical times, of somebody appointed by a nation, by the people who are running the nation, the on the ground politicians, traders, business people, whatever, even the churches. And this person is recognized to have made such a contribution to the life of the nation at such a elevated level, very often in the law, but certainly have a good, who almost stands outside the law to judge, to decide, to exercise a fiat. Now, if you take that away from a nation, you're basically saying we do not trust the people that our system placed in this position. The judges, unlike in America, are not elected. Uh, it's a very mysterious procedure that sets about how people become judges. But the evidence of this was in the tabloid journalism all around the Brexit time, when they were openly defying the verdict of the judiciary. Now, I don't like a lot of things judges do, and I don't like a lot of things American judges do. I've taken a keen interest in the Supreme Court. Uh, but at the end of the day, it's a very, very serious thing to try and inhibit judges. They always say the first man to bring the Nazis in loses the argument. So I don't bring this in as anything to draw parallels with Nazis. But a wonderful film called Judgment of Nuremberg featured the very real things that had happened, where judgment was being exercised on nations and the leaders of nations after a disabling world war. And Burt Lancaster, I think it's the role of his life and the scene of his life, plays one of the judges who's testifying. And he has come to realize, and had come to realize sometime before, that the trial brought it to him, that once the judges had been corrupted, and only the judges could allow themselves to be corrupted, then, as he said, I did it, I accepted it, I ignored what was happening, and I turned my life to excrement. And he knew in saying that he was pronouncing his own death sentence. It's one of the most powerful scenes in movies by one of its greatest actors. So I'm horrified at the direction the government is going. I mean, if there was no other argument for independence, I want that government out and to be history in every sense of the word, for the sake of England, Ireland, all the nations that comprise this disunited kingdom at the moment, because I have friends, relatives, people closer to me than anybody on earth who live in England and have to live under this evil when Scotland becomes independent. It's horrifying, and it should be resisted by all, I say all legal means. When you're dealing with a government controlling some degree the legal processes, attacking judges, you have to say, what are the means to resist us? I'm lost for words on it, really. Not usual
Absolutely,
for
Peter.
me.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we're going to come back to this story as well in the future as the bill continues to make its way through Westminster. But we'll move on to our next story now, which is that the US has helped prepare for the diversion of natural gas supplies from around the world to Europe in the event that the flow from Russia is cut. And that's in an effort to blunt Vladimir Putin's most powerful economic weapon. As fears of an invasion of Ukraine have grown, US officials said on Tuesday that they had been negotiating with global gas suppliers, and they were now confident that Europe would not suffer from a sudden loss of energy for heating in the middle of winter. Russia has already restricted the flow of natural gas through the pipeline which runs through Ukraine from about 100 million cubic meters a day to nearer 50 million cubic meters a day, US officials said. Washington now estimates that almost all of that can be replaced quickly if the pipeline is cut deliberately or as a result of conflict. To ensure Europe is able to make it through the winter and spring, we expect to be prepared to ensure alternative supplies covering a significant majority of the potential shortfall, a senior official said. Fears that Putin would cut off gas supplies have made some European countries, such as Germany, wary of imposing sanctions on Putin if he proceeds with an invasion. The Biden administration also insists that US and European financial sanction plans are converging, and that the US is preparing export controls on Western technology, which would cripple Putin's efforts to diversify his economy. The impact would be far greater than the response to the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea, a senior official said. The US also said it was preparing restrictions on exports to Russia of high-tech software and hardware made by the US and its allies. Officials said that the measures would affect Russian ambitions in the fields of aerospace, defense, lasers, and sensitive maritime technology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. So, Peter, first of all, do you think that this planning for the provision of gas to Europe from elsewhere, do you think is it an indication that the US wants to make sure that Russia is firmly in the camp with its allies, and that Germany is firmly in the camp with its allies, and that Germany is front and centre in the efforts to resist Vladimir Putin's intentions this time.
If I may, just to try and lighten this one before I get to the serious part, a brief old joke. Scotsman living in a bothy with no artificial light of any kind. His wife is experiencing a difficult birth, and he calls out the doctor. And the doctor comes and says, "Have you got a cornel?" So they light a candle and give him the candle. And he says, "Donald, you've got a son." "Donald, you've got another son." "My goodness, Donald, you've got a third son." And Donald says, "For Christ's sake, take the cornel away from it. It's the licht that's attracting them." I think that illustrates the point that we are not prepared to go back to that era. But energy, people have said that oil would be a new dominant factor, and water certainly will be a dominant factor in global interactions. But energy is increasingly the obvious one. It comes up, particularly in the independence debate, the whole thing about renewables. I know there's other aspects of that. And I realise that I don't really know nearly enough about energy. I'm instinctively, morally, in every other sense, totally against nuclear power. But people who understand energy and are as objective as I would hope they would be, say, "But what are you going to do when the lights go out?" And we have people in the independence movement who understand it. And I'm sure we must have highly placed experts in the SNP. But to go back to Putin, what Putin is doing is what all negotiators or international negotiators do in the international version of negotiation, which is diplomacy. The negotiation is an attempt to reach agreement on a point or points, sometimes related, which people do not currently agree on. It's an attempt to find an accommodation by mutual adjustment of position. But implicit in that is always a lever, and at the extreme, a lever becomes a threat. So the basic threat in a negotiation is, "I'll walk away if I don't get a deal." Either party can get up and say, "I've had enough." And I tried to develop a theory of negotiation which involved rushing in and finding out how high somebody's arse was above the seat when they threatened to leave the room as a determinant of the strength of their negotiating position. A micrometer sometimes would have been needed to measure it. So what they're doing is they're playing the cards or threatening to play the cards that they have. And Russia certainly sees itself as having a major part to play in this. I mean, the ideal is that every nation is totally energy autonomous. And that may be a highly desirable outcome, but I doubt in this interdependent world if it will ever come true. Actually, I regard that as a heartening sign, especially coming from someone with Putin. I mean, in negotiation, you either want somebody to do something, modify the way they're doing something, or stop doing something. All negotiating elements can be reduced to that. Are you asking me to do something that I don't do? Are you asking me to modify something that I'm currently doing? Or are you asking me to stop completely doing something that I'm doing? These are the balancing factors in negotiation. And I think it's a heartening sign that we may not come to fisticuffs in the Ukraine. And they are desperately trying to maximize their power. If you don't, then I'll do this. But I don't want to do this. I'm really a nice guy. I want to negotiate. So here's something I might do for you if you will do this for me, or stop doing that. I see heartening signs. I hope I'm not just trying to cheer myself up on this, Andrew, but that's the way I see it.
That's a fair point, Peter. Thank you. That's very helpful. We'll move on to our next story now, which is that legislation has been passed to allow women who have paid for private surgery to remove transvaginal mesh to get their money back. The Transvaginal Mesh Removal Cost Reimbursement Scotland Bill will establish a scheme to repay mesh removal costs, which will open for applications as soon as practically possible after royal assent for the bill. The scheme will be administered by National Services Scotland, which currently looks after the Mesh Fund. Work has been ongoing to finalise contracts with Spire Healthcare in Bristol and Dr. Veronicus in Missouri, America. It is expected that Spire Healthcare will accept referrals from next month, and discussions between NHS, NSS, and Dr. Veronicus are progressing positively. So, Peter, I think there are two aspects to this story this evening. Firstly, the establishment of a scheme to reimburse the costs of women who have paid for private surgery to have the mesh removed, and then development of contractual arrangements between our Scottish NHS and the two principal suppliers of transvaginal mesh removal, which is the Spire Healthcare in Bristol and this leading doctor in Missouri in America. So, firstly, I appreciate completely, we all do, that our Scottish NHS is under pressure like never before at the moment because of the pandemic, and also the collateral damage that the pandemic response has wrought across the whole of healthcare. But do you think we should be considering expanding our own surgical capacity to remove and replace mesh from women affected, rather than contracting it out to surgeons in Bristol and in Missouri?
Well, this is the modern world's problem writ large and exhibited in a smaller but crucial scale. I mean, my heart goes out to these women, because the consequences for them have been really disabling and painful. And I have to say, is paying for removal enough? But that's another story. Should they not be compensated for that? I mean, I cannot experience a woman's pain, but I have what might be described as two, at a stretch, three implants. I've got a mesh which was put in for an inguinal hernia. My chest is wired together from a quad bypass, and I have a lump of metal in the form of a pacemaker embedded in me. Now, all of these things saved my life, or certainly saved me from acute crisis in the case of the inguinal hernia. I do get pain in all of them. Two of the pains, there's nothing can be done about them. The wire, the wiring of the chest can't in any respect be, excuse me, relaxed, and there's nothing you can do about the pacemaker. But the inguinal hernia mesh gives me really sharp twinges at a time. But it would have to be radically greater than that for me to place any burden on the National Health Service, not least for the fact that I've got the highest respect for the surgeons who did all the work, and the surgeon who did the inguinal hernia also gave me a new navel, a new belly button, which is such a work of art that I was planning to exhibit it under a spotlight on a public stage for a payment of £5. I'm very, very proud of my new belly button. Uh, but I think this is a vitally important area. We must move. Whether we can be specialists or practitioners in every aspect, it all comes back into that natural wish to be as self-contained as possible. But I would like to have a fully fledged operating theatre, cordon bleu restaurant, and nuclear safe reactor in my house to deal with all my needs. It's not practicable on that scale. Certain things can only exist on a scale, and therefore in a rational cooperative world, it makes sense to move to areas of specialisation and expertise. But I have no easy solutions for this, Andrew, so that's about all I can say. Heart goes out to the women.
Of course, absolutely, Peter. I was thinking also from the other perspective, from trying to look at this from the other perspective, and I'm thinking of examples where Scotland's NHS has apparently thought outside the box a little bit over the years. And I'm thinking, for example, of the purchase from the private sector of what is now the NHS Golden Jubilee Hospital in Clydebank, which was a
Absolutely.
foreign-owned private hospital, which, in order to quickly and effectively increase capacity for a range of surgical interventions, the Scottish NHS purchased the hospital and now operates it on behalf of everyone. So, do you think there are, using that as an example of innovation in Scotland's NHS, do you think there's a chance that we might see other approaches? Sorry, do you think that this approach that we have at the moment, which is, as you say, allowing those who are most expert at this surgery and funding them to carry out the work, is that another indication of us, rather than sticking to dogmatic approaches, finding the best solution and going for it.
Yes, and I know we're coming to another item which may relate to that, and there are difficulties. I think the Golden Jubilee was a wonderful initiative. I've had some experience of its services. Oddly enough, the Golden Jubilee is built on the site 100 yards away at the end of the long tenement block where I spent the first 9 years of my married life in Dalmuir. I would have had this world-class hospital on my doorstep if I'd remained in my first house. So yes, I think we can do these things. And of course, when independent and able to take the big decisions with the full control of our finances and the ability to borrow appropriately, and there's no reason why a small nation can't make big deals. And I'm sure we have the capacity, the expertise within the nation. I mean, we have to remind ourselves repeatedly what we are. We're the nation of John Hume. We're the nation of Clerk Maxwell, who's largely responsible for everything electronic in the world, including the space race, miniaturization, the internet, and everything else. And these things, I'm not saying we're exceptional, other nations have made major contributions, but we have the capacity. And I do think there's something unique in the Scottish character, whatever that means, that values excellence and will go for excellence. So yes, I do admire what was done there. I think we could do more. We have to make very careful decisions what we do and what we say. No, somebody else can do this better, more safely, perhaps even more economically.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. And now, finally, the number of Scots from the most deprived areas enrolling at Scottish universities is at a new record high. Higher education student statistics published today show a new overall record number of students enrolling in Scottish institutions, an increase of 8.6% compared to last year. This includes a new record high of Scottish domiciled students enrolling at university. There has also been a large increase in the number of non-EU domiciled students, 17% on last year. Commenting on the figures, the Higher and Further Education Minister, Jamie Hebburn MSP, said, "Every young person should have an equal chance of success, no matter their background or circumstance. So it is great to see the number and proportion of Scots from the most deprived areas at university hit a record high." A record number of students enrolled at Scottish institutions in 2020-21, an increase from last year of 8.6% to 282,875. Of those, 180,170 were Scottish domiciled, 34,520 were domiciled elsewhere in the UK, 47,630 were non-EU domiciled, and 20,550 were EU domiciled. 16.7% of Scottish domiciled full-time first-degree entrants to Scottish higher education institutions are from the 20% most deprived areas in Scotland. This is an increase of 0.3 percentage points, or 545 entrants, from 16.4% in 2019-2020. So, Peter, there were a number of numbers there and a number of percentages. So we'll not get involved in that. I think we've covered that this evening already. However, it strikes me that we are told day in, day out by opposition politicians that Scotland's education has been ill served by SNP governments. Now, at least in some respects, these statistics would tend to suggest otherwise. We now have the highest number of people enrolling in our universities and the highest number enrolling from the most deprived communities. So do you think this perhaps suggests that progress is being made, at least in the context of higher education in Scotland?
Yes, I mean, education's a very difficult area to talk about. But first, let me say, I welcome this statistic. I mean, insofar as it's humanly possible, equality of access to higher education is vital. Uh, and a whole series of class stereotypes have been used over the decades and the centuries, indeed, to say, yeah, but not everybody can benefit from higher education. Uncannily, The ones who always benefit from it are the ones whose parents are rich enough to pay for it. And the ones who don't benefit from it are often people who would have benefited enormously from it, but didn't have parents who were rich enough to pay for it. I number myself in the latter category. So we have to look at that. But yeah, I think this is important. There's a lot of groundbreaking scientific research work being done on the relationship of confidence in a human being and the power of action that that human being exercises. And the Guardian is actually running one of these online courses on it, led by this professor, or whoever he is, very highly qualified guy. He's based in Britain. Uh, and but it's a rather expensive. It's 299 quid. So I looked around and found he's written a book on it, which I'm reading. But if I can oversimplify the complexity of it, he's basically saying confidence in itself is not enough. Confidence has to be allied to. Confidence means I believe I have the capacity to do this. What it has to be linked to is the belief that if I do it, it will make a difference. These are the two things that link together. But he makes the point that if confidence is not there in the beginning because of a variety of factors that have been elaborately and highly statistically studied, the person will never achieve their potential. So they don't even get to the point of saying, will it make a difference? Because they don't believe they have the confidence to do it in the first place. And they've taken siblings, identical twins, and they show the crucial nature of it. Now, we all know the theory of the Scottish cringe, and the Scottish cringe is still in marked evidence. So all I can do is applaud this. But please don't lose sight of the fact that people can have a valid, fulfilling life without having gone to university. But if they can and if they want to, not because a pipeline of industry wants them or wants to batter them into a mold, if they want to go to higher education, they should have the right to do that without financial hardship.
Absolutely right. Well put, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. And that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We really do need all of the financial assistance that we can get in order to continue to do what we currently do and to do more of what we do. So please consider subscribing for £5 per month in order to support Broadcasting Scotland. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. But before then, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Peter Curran for his time and his contributions this evening. Peter, it's been grand to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's nice to see you again too, Andrew.
Secondly, coming up after this programme at 8:30, we have a second show with Hugh Stewart, which celebrates the music of Robert Burns. So please stay with Broadcasting Scotland this evening to enjoy Burns Night from the Dungeon at 8:30 this evening. And so, please, have a great Burns Night, however you're celebrating, and please, keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.